Good morning, everybody. This is when you would say good morning. Good morning.
They're all sleepy.
I just still a head nod, like, this is how it works.
You're not committed to the good or the morning.
So a couple of things to welcome to Convocation. We've been doing this a couple of weeks now. I want to give you a shameless plug for next week. Next week will be completely on Zoom. You'll have a link. It'll actually be the same link we've been using all semester, but next week we'll hear from Sabrina. She's the first woman ever exonerated from the death from death row. She'll be sharing her story. She's with an organization called Witness to Innocence. She's coming from Mississippi, but on Zoom. So either way, one other thing I want you to put in your calendars. Next Wednesday from 4 to 7. It may mess with lab, I apologize. Just an opportunity for students. But from 4 to 7, the top floor of HPE, we'll be packing 20,000 disaster relief meals, right? Wow. Very excited about that. So it's an opportunity for you to come, bring your friends, bring your grandma, bring your girlfriend, boyfriend, ex, whatever. Bring them all, help us pack meals. And what happens is you have a hairnet, and you get some gloves, and they'll tell you exactly what you have to do. It's like, scoop one thing of rice, scoop one thing of this, put it in the bag, and then someone will seal it. That's what we're looking for. So anyways, we'd love to have you. Because turns out, even a half hour of doing good for somebody else, there's actually a natural high that comes with it. It's a great way to get outside of your own journey and also learn about international needs and especially international disaster needs. So anyways, today you've come for an interesting dialogue. The University of Pikeville has been on the cutting edge, and we've actually had experts tell us that, on the cutting edge of the dialogue between religion and science. And you guys really have a privilege because two of our own faculty have been co-teaching the class, which I'm sure they'll talk about. But Dr. Darla French, who's been here at the institution for 10 years? Yeah. 10 years, wow. She was 7 when she came. And Dr. James Browning, who has been here for, we'll say, longer than 10 years. Is it 16, 15?
17.
17 years. So anyway, they're going to be sharing with us about this merger, because what happens is we have noticed over time, a lot of students in the sciences in particular have felt this natural, like, you know, if I take that evolution class, or if I study that, and I somehow like given that my faith, and so they're going to talk to us about that. So I count them as dear friends and really appreciate them. So the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everybody. We're excited to see some faces here in person and see some faces on Zoom as well. Dr. Browning and I are very pleased to be here and to have a conversation with you. We are going to have our masks off, at least for the first bit of this, just because we're going to do some readings, and I think it's easier to hear us when we do that. We both are vaccinated, so we feel comfortable being this close to one another and sort of removed from you guys. So did we decide who's going to go first? I'm going to read first. Okay, so what we have done is we've chosen a couple of readings to just open our conversation today. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the research that we're doing and the way that we have structured that class. We're also going to talk a little bit about this handout that you received. If you're on Zoom, we're going to share this with you in a different format. The poster you can see behind us highlights the same things that are on this little handout, and it talks about the 4 different models of how science and religion relate to one another. So we're going to talk through what those models look like. I'm going to start with a brief reading. The authentic spiritual search and scientific inquiry share at their heart the common intention of truth seeking. Historically, they have always been in close relation to one another. Their relationship is the focus of this book that I'm reading from. Actually, is a book that highlights a Festival of Faith convention that happened a couple of years ago, where their topic was how science and religion relate. So what I'm reading is the opening remarks by the gentleman that organizes that festival. All the great spiritual masters of past and present hold wisdom as one of their central points of reference and concern. Defining what constitutes true wisdom versus its opposite never been an easy task. This is why contemplative traditions, which have this question as a central concern, have been celebrated as the repository for genuine insights into the profound truths of life. Similarly, those who pursue great scientific insight devote themselves wholeheartedly and fully to the pursuit of profound knowledge. Like their contemplative counterparts, they too can be removed from the more mundane business of daily life. Their charge, through subjective hypothesis, is to attempt to gain objective insights, and their success has been astonishing. At no other time in human history have the insights of science affected the lives of the many as it does today. Both the spiritual and the scientific seeker are looking to paint a fuller picture of the human experience and our relationship to all life. They aim to map the territory knowable to us for the sake of sharing it with others. The business of this activity is never ending, but its contemporary expressions are in an ongoing relationship with those seekers who have gone before. The hallmark of all great breakthroughs has always been a perspective which balances discernment gained from the past with openness to what the future can be. This balance is the essential foundation from which great learnings can emerge. I think that's a very interesting way to start the conversation, to think that science and religion both have the same goal, and how they relate to one another is different in different folks' minds. We're going to explore that a little bit today.
And one of the things that I've become aware in our dialogue is that not only do science and religion share a similar goal, the search for truth, but also share a similar experience, which is the experience of wonder and awe before nature, in nature. Both of us love hiking, and both of us have this feeling of wonder and awe and mystery when immersed in nature. In the book of Job, there's a forgotten emphasis in the book of Job on mystery and wonder. When God appears to Job, and in a very mysterious way, God begins to show Job all the things that God has created. Isn't this wonderful? Doesn't this create awe in you? So I read it last night and made a list. God shows Job snow, hail, rain, stars, and clouds, and basically says, isn't this cool, Job? I mean, isn't this the best? And then a list of animals, mountain goats, ostrich, horse, hawk, eagle, and again says to Job, isn't this the best? Isn't this just wonderful? Isn't this full of mystery? In a similar vein, Chet Ramo is a professor of physics and astronomy. And in the reading that I've selected, he talks about a wonderful image that balances knowledge and mystery. Okay, he says, all that we know now and forever, all knowledge that we have of this world or will ever have, is like an island in the sea of mystery. I want you to put that image in your head. An island that is all human knowledge and the gigantic sea around it that's mystery. We live in our partial knowledge. Occasionally, at some moments in history, like Galileo or Einstein, a tempest of mystery comes rolling in from the sea and overwhelms our efforts and reclaims knowledge that's built up for years of patient work and forces us to retreat to the most secure core of what we know, where we start over again, start building again, extending the perimeter of our knowledge and security. Knowledge is an island in a sea of mystery. If we accept that knowledge is a finite island in a sea of inexhaustible mystery, then two things follow. The growth of the island does not diminish the sea's infinitude. And the growth of the island increases the length of the shore along which we encounter mystery. It is this last aspect of the metaphor that is most important. We are at our human best as creatures of the shore, with one foot on the hard ground of fact and one foot in the sea of mystery. It is at the shore that the creative work of the mind is done, the work of the artist, poet, philosopher, and scientist. Art and science, and I think by this he means humanities and science, Are each sublime activities of the human mind, we are less than human without either. Both activities thrive at the interface of knowledge and mystery. Each is enriched by the other, and the two activities, although different, have more in common than either scientist or artist are usually willing to admit.
Yeah, and I think that point of commonality is very interesting, something that this gentleman who organized this festival also picked up. He talks about the ability for science to be able to awe us with insight is a lot like the awe that we feel in religious settings. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. Remember Chet Raymo, we're going to talk about him again in a few minutes. I think at the end of this, we're going to open this for questions or if you want insights on anything. So be thinking in the back of your mind if there's anything that you want answered. You can put us on the hot seat and see what we think about your questions. What we're going to do next is take a look at these 4 different models of how relationships between science and religion exist. And so Dr. Browning and I are going to talk about some example people who represent each viewpoint. We're going to talk a little bit about what those viewpoints are. So you can follow along with us if you like on this little quarter sheet. Our poster, which talks a little bit about our own research, has a bigger version of each of those pictures. So if it's hard to see, I know this is small, conserving paper when I printed these the size that I did. So I'm going to introduce us and get us started off with the idea of conflict. That is one of the 4 models of how people can see religion and science to interact. And it's probably the one that is the most common in the way we talk to students and we ask their experience of how the science and religion viewpoints interact. Many of them, the first thing that comes to mind is a conflict, is a fight. In fact, we have done a version of this conversation in the past, and we've had students show up saying, I'm ready for the debate. And Dr. Brown and I are like, well, we're not going to debate. Instead, we're going to talk about the different ways that you can actually reconcile science and religion. It doesn't have to be a debate. So debate may have been the first thing that came to your mind when I said the word conflict. And that's often how science and religion are portrayed in the media. And so you might think, a common thing that really kind of gets people's ire up and gets people very opinionated is thinking about evolution and how does evolution fit into the context of a religious worldview. And so that might be something that you've had personal experience with, or you may have seen that in the media. Very expressed a few years ago, I forget how long ago it was now, but Ken Ham had a debate with Bill Nye, the science guy, about evolution versus intelligent design. So of course, it's a very provocative way to set that up in the media, right? People who are writing media stories want to get people's attention. And so one way to do that is to set up this drama that exists in their mind between science and religion. Ken Ham's a really good example of somebody who likes to poke at science and vice versa. Somebody else you may have heard of that sort of adheres to this worldview that science and religion conflict is a gentleman named Richard Dawkins. He is a world-renowned scientist. He's a geneticist. He's an evolutionary biologist. He lives over in the UK, and he is very vocal about his atheism. And so he says there is a conflict between science and religion such that science wins. That anybody who believes in anything religious, he calls dumb. And so that's very provocative, right? Setting up an immediate conflict that you think, if I believe in science, I can't believe in religion, or vice versa. If I have religious beliefs, I can't believe in science. Our hope today, through talking about the other 3 models, is for you to think about some other ways that science and religion actually can interact. Conflict doesn't have to be the only way. And in fact, if you were to believe the people who study this stuff, it's actually the minority viewpoint among scientists, which is really interesting, right? Because the media portrays it to be this conflict, and so therefore all scientists must hate all religious people. They don't believe anything religious, and vice versa. In reality, that's not true. Most scientists are practicing of a faith or a spirituality in some way. You want to add anything about the conflict model? I think that's the easiest one of these 4, in my opinion, to understand, because it's the one that we are all familiar with. personal experience and maybe have been told yourself that if you believe something scientific, then there's no way that you have faith in it. What about the second model, Dr. Browning? What's an alternative way to think about how science and religion can relate?
Well, I think it's very natural that if people tire of conflict, and notice the first little icon shows a clash, is to say, well, maybe these are two separate things. So you notice in the second drawing, a square and a circle are two different things, right? And I think both scientists and theologians tire of the conflict and want to think of some other way of relating. So it's interesting that the National Academy of the Sciences has an official statement in which they specifically reject conflict as a model between science and religion, and instead say that what we should do is think of science and religion as two independent things. And being independent, they can't conflict with each other. So this statement from the National Academy of Sciences and Institute of Medicine, 2008, science and religion are based on different aspects of human experience. In science, explanations are based on evidence drawn from examining the natural world. Religious faith, in contrast, does not depend only on empirical evidence, is not necessarily modified in the face of conflicting evidence, and typically involves supernatural forces and entities. Because they're not a part of nature, supernatural entities cannot be investigated by science. In this sense, science and religion are separate and address aspects of human understanding in different ways. Attempts to pit science and religion against each other create controversy where none need to exist. So here's a nationally respected scientific organization saying there's no need for there to be any conflict between us.
Yeah, and that sentiment, I think, is very nicely expressed in their statement. It echoes a lot of what some famous scientists have said. Albert Einstein also was a proponent. He did not believe in a conflict. Turns out he actually was an atheist himself, but he thought, to each his own, and folks can believe what they want, and there is no conflict between things. He even kind of pointed out that, according to history, we've set up religion and science to have these irreconcilable differences. And in reality, that's a conflict model, right? Instead, really have this independence model, to each his own, leave it be.
And an example of that is Stephen Jay Gould is an evolutionary biologist who disagrees with Dawkins. And in a famous book called Rocks of Ages, he coined a phrase, Noma, that a lot of people adopted. It's a fancy way of saying non-overlapping magisteria, which is another way of saying science and religion have different realms, they don't overlap. And he says that the realm of science covers the empirical realm, what the universe is made of, fact, and why it works this way, theory. The realm of religion extends over questions of meaning and moral value. The two realms do not overlap. Here's his catchphrase. Science gets the age of rocks and religion gets the rock of ages. They each have an important realm. And those who would try to delineate what the two realms are will say things like the theologian Langdon Gilkey, science explains objective data, religion asks about order and beauty in the world and your inner life. Science asks how questions and religion asks why questions. The authority in science is logic and experimental adequacy. The authority in religion is God, revelation, scriptures. Science makes quantitative predictions that can be tested experimentally. Religion uses analogy, metaphor, simple stories in order to talk about God. So all of these people are just trying to say what you have said here, that science and religion do not overlap. Instead, they answer different sets of questions. And I would say that's probably a common thread in teaching science, isn't it?
It is, and especially when evolution is concerned, because that can be a hot topic for people. And science teachers, if you think about your own experience, science teachers aren't really trained how to deal with talking about that. And so that's where my interest comes in, is trying to figure out about with Dr. Browning, how can we help science teachers be more comfortable to be able to talk about the idea. So a lot of them take the approach that it's independent models. So we're going to focus on the facts of evolution. It doesn't mean anything about your faith. We don't have to talk about the origin of life. In fact, the evolutionary theory does not address the origin of life. It only talks about how life has changed once life was here. So that is a good example of an independent model. So you leave those questions at the door when you come in to science class.
However, I think that the independent model is also, some people have found it to be unsatisfying, because in reality, there seems some overlap, and so others have tried to come up with a different kind of model.
Yeah, so the icons that we chose for this handout and represented also on our poster are very deliberate, right? So the conflict model looks like pow pow in the comic book, like fighting between two individuals. Independence, the square and the circle are far away from one another and they have no connection. In reality, we're all human and we all have connections in our brain. We can't actually compartmentalize and stick science over here on one side and religion over here on the other side. It's only natural to want to figure out how do they fit together. So that's where the next model comes in. Some folks have tried to propose a way that those two realms can interact with one another. And so model number 3 is called dialogue. That's what we're doing today. We're dialoguing, we're talking back and forth with one another. And so you can see now the icon, the circle, and the square do have some overlap. We are maybe trying to address similar questions just from different angles. And so the arrows are representing that, right? Trying to figure out how all of it fits together. We don't have a physical separation of our two drawings anymore. We squished them together and they have some actual overlap. So this is where Chet Rainbow comes in. This is actually the model that Chet follows. So let me read you a couple of excerpts from his writing. We heard one about wonder and awe, thinking about the island in the sea of mystery. I just love that. It's a beautiful thing to think of that. Chet says in his blog, he keeps a blog online, he's a practicing ecologist, which what that means is he studies ecosystems. He's interested in plants in particular and how do they fit into the overall ecosystem in a particular area. So he's an ecologist. He says, I am one of those people trained in science who can't quite accept the idea of God, but I can't quite leave it alone either. I'm a scientist. If I'm to encounter God, it must be as the ground for things I can actually see. If I'm to encounter mystery, it's in the interstices of things known. So he is playing on those connections. He says, if I see something, it's going to cause me to have wonder and awe and mystery. I'm going to want to try to explain it. And if I encounter that mystery, my mind is always searching for an explanation, but that doesn't take away from the mystery that he experiences. So for him, he is a practicing Christian. Is that correct? You know, or does he consider himself spiritual?
I think he considers himself, you might classify him as spiritual, but not religious.
Yeah. So not adhering to any one particular faith, but instead sort of finding that sense of mystery and spirituality in everyday things that he encounters.
And how I encountered him is he actually writes devotional books about finding awe and mystery in nature. They're modeled upon like Catholic devotional books that have the hours and times of the day to pray, except he has reflections on nature there.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. One of my favorite books of his is The Path, where he just talks about, for him, the meditative quality of following the same path every day through nature, noticing the things that he sees, but for him it sort of creates this sense of meditation which connects him to that larger sense of spirituality. That's very cool. Another example of someone who believes in the dialogue model, somebody more famous that you might have heard of before, is the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama is the head of Buddhism, is that right? Tibetan Buddhism. And he actually also adheres to this model of dialogue, the idea that science and religion both have something to learn from one another. To the point where if science finds a fact that actually disproves something in Buddhism, he says science wins. You can hear the language. We are sort of ingrained in using that conflict model. I'll say science wins, like it's a battle. So it's more of a dialogue, and that religion has something to learn from science, and science also has something to learn from religion. So a quote from the Dalai Lama: "If scientific analysis were conclusively to demonstrate certain claims in Buddhism to be false, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon those claims." What do you think about that, Dr. Browning?
Well, what I find fascinating about him is that he also has this ongoing project of dialoguing with neuroscientists about the brain, because Buddhists are very interested in meditation and how the mind works. And so he thinks that neuroscientists have something to learn from the profound study of the mind and how it works in Buddhism. So Buddha was 600 BC, so 2,600 years of experience with meditation. He thinks Buddhism has something to teach neuroscientists. So he thinks it goes both ways. That Buddha should listen to science and do away with beliefs that may be antiquated. At the same time, their profound study of meditation has something to say.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, because a lot of this conversation sort of centers on personal meaning and where you find personal meaning. And that's a really good example of something that's more widely applicable, right? We can actually benefit as a society if we can figure out how the brain works, and meditation is going to help us figure that out. That's a much wider application than just on the personal level. So yeah, very cool. Well, that sets us up then to talk about the last model. And the last model is called integration. You can see the circle actually is lost a little bit in the printing. The circle is completely covered up by the square. So tell us a little bit about integration, Dr. Browning.
And actually, I think I can tell you a little bit about integration from the origin of this handout, which is, I've taught a religion and science class for a long time, both in a previous institution and here. And I used to draw these things on the board. Like I would draw conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. So I found those models in research. They're models that Ian Barbour developed and McGrath worked on. So my research led me to these four models. And then we started teaching together, and we decided to come up with this material. So we enlisted Jess Shadrick, who was a art major here at UPike and a religion minor, and just talked to her, and she drew these conceptions. She made us icons. We said, "You're an artist, make us icons." And then after she did that, Dr. French developed this handout and wrote the simple explanations of each model that you see here. So Dr. French designed the handout, put all the material together, and integrated it into something useful that people could understand. Our goal was something short and easy to understand. So that's how integration works. So humanities, religion, and science cooperated to produce this so that people could understand what's going on. So integration is the idea that our circle and our square, if you look at them carefully, if you design the circle, it fits right inside the square. Neither one loses its identity. They're both, each one maintains its own boundaries, and yet they fit together nicely. And so there are those people who have tried to reconcile science and religion fully and integrate them into one understanding. And one of those people was named Arthur Peacock, who was a biochemist and also an Anglican priest, and did important research on DNA. And can you vision in your head the double helix that is the portrayal how DNA works? Describe for us a double helix. As a religion professor, I think I need to ask the biologist how a double helix works.
The double helix is a good way to think about how that's constructed. You probably all have seen a cartoon representation of what DNA looks like, right? That's something that is a common thing that pops in people's mind. From a structured standpoint, to think about how it's formed, it's sort of like the two rungs of a ladder. There's the connections, there's the rungs, and then there's the sides of the ladder, and then the ladder gets twisted. So you have two strands of DNA, and you're connected like the rungs of a ladder to create this double helix.
I like that image. So you take a ladder and in your mind, twist it, then that makes it really connected. And Arthur Peacock said that's how religion and science work together. They're like a double helix. They intertwine in people's lives and they have real connections. And if you pull it apart, then you don't have anything. I suppose if you pull that DNA structure apart, it wouldn't work as DNA anymore. would it?
No, it wouldn't. So an example in science, we call that an emerging property. So where the whole is more than the sum of its parts. If you take the DNA helix apart, you still have the components that made up the DNA, but they don't do anything. They don't function the same way that DNA molecule does.
I like that. So
Yeah.
then when these components come together in this unique structure, bam,
Yep.
we have life.
Yep.
So that's how Peacock says religion and science work together. If they intertwine and work together, bam, we've got something wonderful and great that can actually benefit humanity. So that was his image. I've always liked that image very much. And then I want to mention one other person that we've had speak here. Ilia Delio is a Roman Catholic theologian with an interesting story that I'll tell shortly, which is that she majored in biology in college, went on and did a PhD in pharmacology, got a postgraduate fellowship to work at Mayo Clinic, which is prestigious, doing research on medication, and then decided that she wanted to take holy orders in the Catholic Church, so she became a nun. Didn't like the first order that she took, asked permission to take a different order, which emphasizes learning and knowledge and being in the world. And that group of Catholics said, you know, you're brilliant, you need to get a PhD in theology. So they sent her to get a PhD in theology. So she holds doctorates in both fields and has written some creative books on how the two can be integrated and work together. And I think the central aspect that she has to say is that she suggests that maybe evolution is God's mode of creativity. That is, God created the world to be created. Does that make sense? And that evolution is the tool through which that happens. Evolution, obviously very fertile. It's created countless life forms over the course of the ages. And then she says, underneath that creativity, that is evolution, is God's creativity that's driving everything. She says, love is the deepest creative power in human existence. So hers is a meditation on how love and evolution can be merged together to form a vital view of the world that 21st century people could understand and use.
It's beautiful. You want to talk a little about the art?
I can. Would you like for me to?
Yeah, so there's a gentleman that we'll talk about that predates Ilia Delio.
And
She draws a lot on his work. So
Yes.
it's not a new thing to try to think about how these two fields can fit together.
No, not at all. So in graduate school, I read Pierre Tayar, who was a paleoanthropologist, did his work in China. So he was involved in work on the Peking man discovery. So he studied evolution, but he was also a Catholic priest. And he began to think of how to put these together. And I think that you could say that Tayar saw the world as this ever-evolving, complex, interconnected reality that just each step of the way, each breakthrough, like the breakthrough from atoms to molecules, and the breakthrough from molecules to organic molecules, and then the breakthrough to humanity, and then now humanity has created a worldwide web of which our knowledge is connected. We're not just individual human beings. So Tayar saw that evolution was a good thing, that actually could benefit humanity if you thought about it at large scale. And his view was that God was the omega point towards which evolution was moving. So that God represents, if things were whole and complete and just the way they were supposed to be, that's God. And the world process is trying to move in that direction. Not saying that it inevitably will, because we can take wrong turns. So he found an almost poetic way of uniting the two. drawing from both his scientific and his religious background.
So do you think he fits the integration model?
Yes, I think he deliberately, I think for his own sake, nothing that he wrote was published until after he died. So, because at the time it was considered controversial. So, he did it for his own self. That is, he was trying to think this thing through, try to integrate the two important parts of his life into one. And I think that's a good point. This is not theoretical. You said this. Inside of our heads, we're all thinking about this. Even if you're not a scientist, you deal with science on a daily basis. And science is an important part of modern culture.
I think that's a good, I'm gonna share a take on Tayar. So Dr. Browning wasn't expecting that question, so he did a really good handling. I'm gonna read, this is an excerpt from an article that was published by a practicing scientist in 1977. So he is a geneticist, he's an evolutionary biologist. He also considers himself to be a creationist, which is very interesting because that's often the conflict model, right? You can't believe in creation and evolution. Talks a little bit about that. Does the evolutionary doctrine clash with religious faith? It does not. It is a blunder to mistake the Holy Scriptures for elementary textbooks of astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology. Only if symbols are construed to mean what they're not intended to mean can there arise imaginary, insoluble conflicts. One of the great thinkers of our age, Pierre Tayar, wrote the following: is evolution a theory, a system, or a hypothesis? It is much more. It's a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforward bow, and which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thought must follow. This is what evolution is. Of course, some scientists, as well as some philosophers and theologians, disagree with some parts of Tayar's teachings. The acceptance of his worldview falls short of universal. But there's no doubt at all that Tayar was a truly and deeply religious man, and that Christianity was the cornerstone of his worldview. Moreover, in his worldview, science and faith were not segregated in watertight compartments, as they are with so many people. They were harmoniously fitting parts of his worldview. Tayar was a creationist, but one who understood that the creation is realized in this world by means of evolution. And what year was Tayar alive?
He was in the early 1900s,
Yeah.
World War I, World War II, just after World War II.
Beautiful.
I agree. I was enchanted with him when I first read it.
I think from a practical standpoint, with the dialogue that we have been having here, we want to try to help our type students figure out how to let these two pieces of their brain communicate and how they can coexist. So is anybody science majors that's here? Probably not. I'd say a lot of our science majors come in with this, they've either been told or they've picked it up throughout, their childhood, that they can't simultaneously believe, it's often evolution that's picked on, evolution and religious views, and if they're studying one, it means that they're a bad Christian, or it means that they're a bad spiritual person, whatever religious faith they adhere to. Evolution we have used here as an example. It's not the only example of science, though, that it's, we see that conflict model. Climate change is another one. So climate change is an interesting, also hot button issue, whether you believe that it's a trend upward or not. Oftentimes religion is painted in this picture that climate change can't be real, because if it were, what does that mean for God? God's like not taking care of the earth like he's supposed to. So it raises also sort of those existential questions about what is God doing for me and in my life and for the world if climate change can be real. So I picked on evolution and we talked about that, but it's not by any means the only issue where we can see conflict between science and religion. So our dialogue, I think, is hopefully going to help our type students figure out how to put those puzzle pieces together in the worldview. And by extension, I hope maybe will help some future teachers out there as well.
And I think our goal has been, we're not prescribing for you which of these models is right. want people to see that there are more options. And I invite you and those who are listening to wrestle with these same issues, realizing that there are at least 4, probably more options. These are the simple ones to explain, by which people can relate science and religion, and then perhaps we can find one that's fruitful, that actually works, and helps us move forward.
Yeah. I think that's a really good place to end our dialogue. So in a minute, we're going to open it up if you all have questions. We'd love to hear those. You want to flip over on the back of this handout, there's a quote that I thought is maybe a good way to end our dialogue today. This is a quote from Thomas Merton. You can see at the bottom, he was quite the spiritual man, right? An American Trappist monk. What does that mean, Dr. Browning?
It's a particular order.
Okay, so it's an order within Catholicism?
Yes.
Okay. Writer, theologian, mystic, I love that one. Poet, social activist, scholar of comparative religion. Merton says, "It is true that neither the ancient wisdoms nor the modern sciences are complete in themselves. They do not stand alone. They call for one another. Wisdom without science is unable to penetrate the full sapiential meaning of the created and the material cosmos." Sapiential means intellectual. Science without wisdom leaves man enslaved to a world of unrelated objects in which there is no way of discovering or creating order and deep significance in man's own pointless existence.
I love that quote, by the way. So, wisdom tells us the point, and science tells us how the world actually works, factually speaking. But it would be nice if we could have both factual understanding of the world and deep wisdom that would help us live fruitfully.
What questions do you all have for us?
I have one question. Because you guys have been thinking about this and teaching it how many years now together?
I think 6, maybe 7.
I think that's great.
What is one way that the other discipline has helped you understand something inside your own discipline? What I mean is, like someone who said, I became a better Christian the more I knew about Buddhism, right? So like Buddhism helped them understand their own tradition. What is it? Yeah, you get the question.
Yeah, I think for me, dialogue with Dr. Browning has helped me examine my own personal beliefs. And by extension, it has helped me figure out how to talk to my students about it. And so in terms of sort of practical applications, I think it also has just reignited that spark of wonder and mystery and awe that I experienced when I learned how a cell works. So that's science, right? But it's amazing to me that life is here at all. To think about all of the steps that have to happen in order for cell membranes to exist, and then for those cells to be able to reproduce. Like, it's kind of focused for me, brought into sharp focus, the wonder and the awe and the mystery of it.
I think one aspect, and by the way, we have an ongoing dialogue, and we set the class up and we co-teach, where we're constantly talking to each other and asking questions ourselves, which we've done during this presentation. And none of those questions we asked each other during the presentation were planned. They just naturally how we relate to one another. So I've always had this understanding that the world in which we live, things are related. So I have a relational view of God. I think God's interrelated with the world. And in Buddhism, there's this teaching that everything in the world depends on everything else and is related. But through dialogue with Dr. French, understanding what evolution actually means, I think we have this weird idea, because we see it in pictures, that evolution is just this one straight line that's just moving along, and that's not, you taught me, that's not how it is at all. It's this remarkable interrelationship of different entities and their environment and the cosmos, and the way that scientifically things connect. And then I began to start to apply that to my hiking. I used to say, oh, that's a pretty butterfly, but then I asked myself questions about how the butterfly fits in this whole it's in. It just increased my appreciation for nature and how nature works. And you've also emphasized the importance of observation, that I can do more than say it's a pretty butterfly. I can actually look at it and see the pattern. Does that make sense? That actually teaching me about how scientifically the world is interrelated and how important observation is have enriched my own appreciation of the beautiful creation that's around us.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. I know we're at time, another classroom coming in. We greatly appreciate you also modeling scholarship for us at a place where you're asking lots of questions and growing yourself. I just think that's really incredible. So thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you everyone for coming.
Thank you.